First of all, apologies for not having PowerPoint. I actually don't even know how to use PowerPoint, but we'll try to make a go of it here. So I'm going to start by saying a little bit about my background, because it'll give you a sense of my perspective on this stuff. So I graduated in August of 2014 and started at Lignon at that same time. And right at that time is when I started applying for the grant. So the perspective I have is of someone who has very little experience of applying to grants. And so it might not generalize to your situation. I'm not sure. I'll leave it up to you. And the things I'm going to say, I think, are going to reflect the kinds of anxieties and worries I had while I was doing them. So people who have done a lot of grants probably weren't worried about a lot of this stuff. But maybe if you haven't done very many grants, it'll be useful information. So here's some background about my application. It's not super important. I want to start by talking about how I started to think about the whole thing. Because I was new to the process, I was wondering what kinds of resources I could use to tackle the issues that I needed to do to fill out this application. And so one big thing I made use of, which I actually didn't put on here, is our Office of Research Support at Lignon. They were really good at helping me to understand just the basic process. So if you have an Office of Research Support, I highly recommend you contact them. They will help you to fill the things out. In addition to that, I talked to my colleagues, and they said two main things. I'll skip the first one because it's been covered and is controversial. But the second one was really emotionally helpful for me, which was they had me picture the grant applying process like this. Don't think of it as a sort of one-shot deal. You put your grant in, and if you get it, you get it. If not, new project. Think of it as just a first step in a potentially longer-term process. Maybe you won't get the first one. You'll get some comments back. You can revise it and then turn in a new one. This was a very emotionally helpful thing for me in approaching it. In addition to that, what was helpful to me is I looked at a lot of successful grants and tried to gather how I might do things based on those grants. So one of the big things I needed to know is what are the kinds of durations and fundings that are appropriate to my discipline. So I'm a philosopher. That's the humanities. We don't really do many studies or need research assistance. We just sort of sit down and have a think about things. So I needed to figure out, like, how much money do I have to get to have a think about things? So I looked at other people who are philosophers to see how they did things. And even within philosophy, there's different kinds of things depending on what your research aims are. So if you're trying to write a book or write an article, at least within my field, it looked like the grants, which were more book-related, tend to be longer term. The article-related tend to be shorter in duration. So I tried to use that to help guide me. Also, like many of you, I'm sure your fields are quite diverse. People are working on lots of different kinds of questions. There's nobody who's working on just the question you're working on or not working on them in the same way. And so one of the most helpful things for me was to see, by looking at a lot of different kinds of grants, to piece together a model of how I was doing things. So I work on ethics. There's another person in my department who works on that too, but they work on it a different way than I do. But there's somebody who works on a different question who uses similar methods to me. So using those two, I was able to piece together a model of what a grant would look like that fit exactly my kind of research profile. And finally, for someone who didn't know how to do this process, it was really helpful to know the level of generality and the detail that goes into all of the specific parts of the application, because I didn't really know much about that at the time. Finally, let me say a few things about things I wish I had done, which I didn't do. One thing I wish I had done is just ask people what are typical comments you get, both on successful and unsuccessful proposals, and what are things that reviewers have anxieties about, like what are the kinds of things that get them worried. I didn't do that, but in the future I think I would do that. Another thing is there's lots of general grant writing resources on the internet. I wish I had spent more time looking at that stuff. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is maybe specific to me, but perhaps other people have faced this problem too. So when I was going into this process, I had a lot of very specific questions I wanted to work on, but I had no idea what my answers to these questions would be really, or what I would end up arguing. I think some people don't have this problem. They kind of know what they're going to say. They just need to work out the details. But I think some people may have this problem. So that was the main thing I was worried about going into the process. And so what I tried to do to address this was to try to show that even though I didn't have answers or hunches at answers yet, I had narrow and well-defined questions, and there are well-understood methods in literature to be drawn, and so there was some license to be optimistic about the possibility of progress. Okay, with this in mind, what I'm going to do now is just talk about how I try to approach the specific sections of the grants, given these concerns I had. So this, I think you can see, reflects the kinds of things I was worried about versus other people who've done it a lot before. I just didn't even know what to fill out in the different fields. So I was just thinking, well, how do I do this? So here, I'm just going to walk you through how I did this. So the abstract of the research part is, of course, the most general part. And my whole motivation here was just to sketch the basic interest in the kinds of questions I'm interested in. Philosophy can sometimes be pretty abstract and not interesting to the public, so there's an important place to be had to spend a little bit of time explaining what's interesting from the perspective of anybody in the humanities, say, about the questions I was interested in. And then what I tried to do is condense the series of questions I was working on into a small list, maybe one or two, and then make any brief connections to previous research. Now, at the time I was doing this, I just started at Lignan, and I was just teaching, and it was already August, and it didn't have a lot of time. So one thing that was really important to me was to find ways of filling out this grant without doing way too much work. And so what I found useful was to find out other things I used and already had that I could just import to deal with the grant. So because I just was on the job market, one of the best things for me, and maybe for other people who are just starting, is to look at your job market materials. Usually you have lots of stuff about what your research is and why it's interesting. And so I just took a lot of that stuff. I used some stuff from previously published work and scholarship applications. And I think the most helpful thing to me was just to remember the kind of small talk you do when people ask you what you work on. And that was basically what I did in the beginning part of that. All right, for the next part of it, which are on the long-term impacts and objectives, basically what I tried to do is just say in a little bit more detail what the philosophical background of what I was doing was, rather than just talking about why people in the humanities might care, and then explain the relationship with my work between that. And again, here I was worried about how to do this in enough time, and so I just tried to draw on some previous work I did. So I just looked at my research statements and some dissertation materials, and I looked at other successful grants and just tried to model it after that. And all of this stuff, I think, basically took very, very little time to do, actually, by looking at this previous stuff. And that really, really made the process much, much easier for me, because I think our internal deadline was something like September or something, so I had a few weeks or something to do it. All right. The part that was hardest for me was the next part about the background of the research. And so this was my longest and most detailed section. I approached it in 3 parts. I essentially spent a bunch of time expanding on the abstract and talking about what's actually interesting about my question and saying something about philosophy. And then I just expanded on each of the particular questions. And I made sure, again, because philosophy can be kind of abstract even to other philosophers, to use examples that got people engaged with the kinds of questions I was interested in, and then explain all of the particular more detailed issues and say why they're all important, and then make larger connections. All right. The last bit about the research plan and methodology, this again was the hardest thing for me because I knew what I wanted to do, but I didn't know what I was going to say. And so what I tried to do is just make the case for the existence of certain methods to solve my problem and explain why there would be license for optimism that these methods would work. So for example, in my case, my questions that I was interested in hadn't been really researched that much, but there were some analogous questions that have been researched and methods for solving them. And so this, I think, is a useful thing anytime you have a new topic. If you can make the case, though, even though your topic's new, there's other topics which are well understood, and analogous techniques can be used to approach your topic. That's the kind of thing people are going to have license for optimism that broaching this new topic will be effective. All right, the last thing I'll talk about is funding, and this might be relevant to humanities people. For us, I guess the main thing we ask for is teaching relief. And so I mostly asked for teaching relief. I asked for some books and conference travel and a few other things. I got most of my money cut, but I got enough. I just had the teaching relief money was still basically there, which was fantastic. That's the thing I needed. But the thing that was news to me, and I didn't know it was possible, was that apparently you can get your thing approved while losing some money. So that was great. That was something I wish I had known beforehand, is that was possible. I think I would have approached it a little differently. In particular, the way I approached it, I considered what's the minimum amount of money I need to take on this project if I work as ambitiously as I can about it. That's how I filled out the proposal. If I had known there's a possibility of it getting approved without getting all of the money, I probably would have thought, well, what's the amount of money that would be enough if I got all of it for it to be manageable, not super ambitious given that amount of money, but just manageable. I probably would have asked for a little bit more money in that kind of situation. So that was very important news for me. The last thing I'll say is something about the reviews I got. Most of the reviews, the main critical comments I got was that the project may be too ambitious, and I think that's probably a fair criticism of my project. But But I don't know, again, how much that would generalize. I guess one of the main points is you should think about what a relevant scope would be. But yeah, so I guess those are the main comments. That's pretty much all I got, but let me just say a few things just to sum up. So again, one of the things I said is look at what university support systems you have to help you with your applications. Try to think of it as a first step in a larger process. Try to look at people who did good in the past, and try to do as much based on stuff you already have, because at least for me, it's emotionally difficult to spend a lot of time writing a grant instead of doing work. So try to minimize the amount of time just writing a grant, use stuff you got. And finally, one of the big things for me was to try to convey to my evaluators why they should be optimistic that I could actually answer the questions I was asking. Thanks.